Welcome back to the Ag Bowl Podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Grisafi. This broadcast was filmed in Valparaiso, Indiana. This podcast will be available on our YouTube channel and also on Spotify and Apple and anywhere you enjoy listening to podcasts. Today's special guest is the Farm CPA. Now, Paul Neiffer is someone who I'd met probably 15 years ago. And if you've ever attended an ag meeting or went to the accounting part at any of the major ag events, you've probably met Paul. And now more than ever, I think is an interesting time to talk about farming, agriculture, taxes, income. And there's so many questions as I deal with farmers all day that I don't know. So I have to say, Paul Neiffer, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tommy. It's great to join the Ag Bowl Media Podcast.
The old Ag Bowl. Not a great time to have a podcast called Ag Bowl as the commodity markets are sliding, but we knew that when we came up with the name a few years ago. You are in one of the hottest states in America right now, Colorado, and that's because of college football.
Yeah.
But where are you in Colorado, Paul?
I'm actually in Parker, Colorado, which is a suburb of Denver. We're on the far southeast part of Denver Metro. We're about 6,600 feet of elevation. We actually have a little 6-acre ranchette with a little 4-stall horse barn. We look right down at Pikes Peak, about 50 miles to the south, and then the Front Range. And we're surrounded by a 200-acre horse ranch, so it looks like we have 200 acres, but we don't.
You look like the big Yellowstone owner.
Yeah, I'm a long ways away from that.
I like it. Well, I have so many questions. I'm happy for you and your family that when I had contacted you a few months ago, I didn't realize you left from Washington. When I think Paul Neiffer, I think Washington, and not the capital, the other Washington.
Oh, yeah, the better Washington by far.
Yeah. Tell a story real quick before we get into the podcast about the angle of when they harvest wheat. I don't know that a lot of Americans or people in agriculture realize how they farm and grow and raise wheat that far out west with those inclines.
Yeah, so just to give you an idea, the new combines now on the hillside modification that we add onto a combine, it'll go up to about, I think my memory is 38%. Now, there's also a monitor in a lot of these combines that tell you if you exceeded the 38%. And many times when you're on those hillsides, you're in the 45, 50, 55% range. My dad actually flipped a combine when I was about 16 years old. It was a brand new combine going up a hill, and the transmission gear actually blew up inside of the transmission, and suddenly he's going backwards. And back then you actually stood up to drive a combine half the time. You could either stand up or sit down. And so as he started going backwards, he grabbed the steering wheel and tried to turn it in the hillside. Well, he turned it in too fast and it flipped over and didn't kill him, but it drove a throttle lever through his thigh. And the EMTs finally showed up and they had to hand a hacksaw to my dad, and he had to hacksaw himself out of the combine. So the funny story about that.
There's a feel-good part?
Well, it's a good part, in a way, a funny part. For farmers, they especially enjoy this probably. I was telling that story to a city person, and they asked me, your dad had to hacksaw his leg off? And I go, no, he had to hacksaw the throttle lever off. So just one of those things growing up on a farm.
Yeah, well, farm safety is important, so let's
start
the podcast with that. I have a whole list of things I want to talk to you about, but first, introduce yourself. Like, I know you, I think others know you, but maybe my listeners on the podcast don't know you. And of course, with the podcast, we never know who's going to click the button and hit play.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I grew up on a wheat and dry pea, green pea, barley farm in southeastern Washington state near the town of Dixie, which nobody knows where Dixie is, but I think a lot of people have heard of Walla Walla, Washington. So it's down in that southeastern part. Grew up on a farm there, went off to college in Seattle at University of Washington, got my accounting degree. And then I started as a CPA with Moss Adams, which is a probably top 15 firm in the U.S. now. Was there for about 6 years. And then, believe it or not, two of my friends that were at the firm, we split off and went down to Central Oregon, Bend, Oregon, and opened up our own firm down there. And I was there for about 9 years. Also, during that period, started a 1031 exchange business. So many farmers want to sell real estate and not pay taxes, we would have been the intermediary to handle that. So did that for about 9 years, then moved back to Yakima, Washington for about 10, 15 years, and then moved to Dayton, Washington about 7 years ago, was there on a 200-acre little ranch. We were on the river and had a couple barns and so on. And then about a year ago, right about now, a year ago, my wife came to me and said, I love the ranch in Dayton, but I love my grandkids more. So we moved to Colorado to be closer to the grandkids.
And they say happy wife, happy life. So I think you made a
Yeah.
great
And
decision. But for the family, I mean, you could have everything and still be lonely out there, right?
Yep, yep, exactly. But in my career, when I started off, really in Yakima, there's a lot of ag, but when we were in Central Oregon, not so much ag. So when I moved back to Yakima, definitely was more involved in ag. And then about, believe it or not, Tommy, it's been almost 15 years now. I started the farmcpatoday.com blog back in March of 2009. So next March, it'll be 15 years. And because of that, I ended up getting sort of reached out to by Jeannie Bernick, a top producer at that time, and asked me to do a couple columns. So I wrote a couple articles, and then she asked me to be a columnist for Top Producer magazine. So I started doing that. And then that proceeded to a podcast for Top Producer. I teach about 2,000 CPAs and other tax professionals around the country each year on farm taxes, and then work with, even though I'm now technically retired from CLA as of the end of last year, and I have a covenant not to compete, but I still do some consulting as long as it doesn't compete with them. So I
I
still
think that's good
enjoy.
for your mind, for your
Yeah,
mental mindset.
exactly.
I know one interesting. Go ahead. Sorry for interrupting you. You said
Well, and
I
then I was
still
going to,
enjoy. What do you
yeah,
still enjoy?
I still enjoy it. And then my son, my oldest son, is in real estate, and he's got me in about 20 real estate deals. So I have to do all those returns for him. So that keeps me busy too. So I'm enjoying. I'm only retired from CLA. I'm not retired from being the farm CPA.
And CLA, for the folks who don't know, as we talk in acronym, CLA is Clifton Larson and Associates.
Clifton Larson Allen, which is currently
Clifton
the
Larson
eighth
Allen.
largest CPA firm, professional services firm in the country. So, and we have actually offices in most of the farm belt states, corn belt states. Some of those states we probably have 6 or 7 or 8 offices. So quite a few offices in those states.
So that's how I met you on the speaking circuit, was probably Top Producer. Now, one thing I noticed because of podcasts and shows like this and education series, people aren't going out to the shows. Have you spoke at a big event lately where you're like, wow, it was packed?
The top producer event in Nashville this, in February was fairly full. They're actually going to have it next year in Kansas City. I've been to other events that they were expecting 300 and ended up with 150, and I've been to other events where they expected 75 and we had 200. So
Oh, that's good to hear.
it just depends on where you're at. But they are starting to curtail some of that. A lot of this is virtual now. I don't really
Mm-hmm.
like the virtual, although like you and I had talked offline a little bit, it's much easier to reach out to 1,000 or 5,000 people doing one of these podcasts than to do it otherwise. So that's the way we're sort of communicating a lot of information to farmers and other associated with ag.
And the world's changed from when you and I met 15 years ago. I think we were at the iPhone 3 or 4. Probably
Yeah,
when you and I met, people still had flip phones.
yeah,
I don't even know. Maybe I had an iPhone when I met you. And I had the first one. So I know when you stayed at our house out in Des Moines, Indiana, you were doing some work in Lafayette. It was maybe 10, 11 years ago. And it was just a different world. And we
yep,
had the iPhone. But the way we use YouTube, I was not personally listening to any podcast till the pandemic. I had I signed up for a Spotify account to actually listen to Joe Rogan. I'm like,
okay,
what's this mean? Joe Rogan's moving from YouTube to Spotify, and why are my kids talking about Spotify? I use Spotify so often now, and a lot of shows out in the ag world. I don't listen to them necessarily live, but I listen to them on the recording at my
yep,
own pace, on my own time, maybe only half the show this time and half others. And it's interesting because during this show, we give away flags. We give away flags for farmers. And I'll offer it out now. If you're watching the show within the first few days of the show release, email us at flags@agbull.com and we'll send you a free American flag. And that deal's still good when this episode comes out. But people see the show from all over, and
yep.
it's flattering, right? So I send someone a beautiful American flag, and I make a new friend, and you never know who you meet. But when you go to one of those specific events, people paid to go to that event. So you actually, if you go to top producer event, there's 500 people. Those are 500 people who are either comped from a big ad company or paid to go to that event. So you kind of, not kind of, you know your crowd, right?
Yep,
If you go to a
exactly.
car race and it's NASCAR, you know your crowd versus something else. Well,
Well, and
I
I
think,
also
yeah.
forgot to mention, Tommy, that being a farm boy, I wanted to get some land, and actually, when my parents had passed away, my brother, sister, and I, we sort of decided to sell the land. In
Hmm.
hindsight, I sort of wish we'd kept it, but there was various reasons why we sold it. But during the pandemic, right in the middle of the pandemic, I went to a farm auction in Iowa, bought a quarter section there, and then about a year later, I bought 360 acres of irrigated ground down in southwest Missouri. And then the year after that, last year, I bought about 250 acres of good farm ground about a mile from where I grew up. So steep hills. Actually, I rode on the combine last year, and we were on a little bit of what's called an eyebrow. That's where it sort of goes from flat to steep, and you have really probably a 60-70% slope if you hit it the wrong way. So you definitely want to be a little careful when you hit that eyebrow.
That's interesting. And farmland's interesting. Some people trade it like the market. They buy, sell, buy, sell. Some people say buy this and never ever sell it because they aren't making any more. They're
Yep.
just tearing it up for big homes and dollar stores.
Yep.
What's your
But
philosophy on that, Paul?
I probably, well, if I was smart and
You are smart.
if I was smart, like my Iowa ground, I paid $6,000 an acre for it. It's probably worth 15 now. If I was smart, I would sell that and then roll it over into less valuable farmland that I think is going to go up in value. But I'm probably more of a buy and hold on
Hmm.
farmland. Now I probably know that when I pass away, my wife and I pass away, I doubt if my four boys are going to keep it. I know that. I have no problem with that. That's up to them to decide what they want to do with it. But I'm probably, I think if you want to get rich off of farmland, I think it's probably more of a trade.
Hmm.
If you really enjoy the land and have that emotional attachment to it, which I think I probably more of, then I think it's more of a buy and hold.
Yeah, but think about that land in Iowa when you go combine corn or beans, whatever's on it this year. I mean, how much fun is that to say that this is your ground? I
Well,
take pride in mowing my quarter acre yard.
yeah. Well, and typically every time I show up to Iowa to ride the combine, it rains. So I'm actually scheduled to be there in about 2.5 3 weeks, and hopefully I get some combining in.
You should have been there in August because it didn't rain much in August in that particular area.
Yeah, we've
That's
gotten all the rain out here at our house in May and June. I think we got a total of almost 20 inches of rain, which is unheard of.
in
So
Colorado.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
because you guys have been abnormally dry, and
Until this year, and then we were
you've come out of
abnormally
that
wet.
cycle, right? And the
Yeah.
Kansas folks, we have a associate of mine has an office in Kansas, and it was just horrible
Yep.
to eat. Everything was grown well. The only thing that was grown before was the weeds, and now everything's growing. So
Yeah.
moisture's back. Imagine having cattle and being in a drought. No one. There's no good scenario being in a drought. There's
No.
nothing good.
Well, and it's
And,
like my farm out in Washington State. I had a crop on it last year. Probably the wheat averaged about 125 to 140. This year we had a drought. It averaged 85.
mhm.
So in a
Those are big
drought year,
bushels.
for a lot of farmers, a drought, if they got 85, they'd be tickled pink. Here in Colorado,
Hmm.
people would typically probably get 30 or 40 bushels, and a lot of them are probably getting 70 or 80 this year. So it's all relative.
Speaking, we're going to stick to ag for a second. I was thinking about something about Washington. When I think of Washington, I think of telephone poles and people growing hops. Is that still popular out by you?
Yep. Yeah. So Yakima Valley still the number one hop growing region in the world.
I thought
Yeah.
so. You
Yeah.
didn't tell me
Probably.
to say that. I
Yeah.
remember that.
I
Yeah.
think they grow about 70% of the hops in the U.S. Idaho's about 15%, maybe a little bit more, and then Oregon, the Willamette Valley is a little bit less than that. And then
Hmm.
there's pockets around the country that grow some hops. But yeah, I would say 90-95% of the hops is grown in the Pacific Northwest.
That's interesting. Well, that became really popular. I don't know. It's quite the fad it used to be. I think.
It's, beer drinking consumption's going down, but the microbreweries are still, and of course they've developed different type of hops
hmm
for the microbreweries. So it's those farmers are still doing okay.
I'm kind of a White Claw guy myself, or a High Noon, but that's just me, you know.
That's my son. He'd
Put
rather
some
have
ice
that than a
cubes in a
beer.
glass, and I literally I almost never drink a beer. But if you and I went to like a craft brewery and you said you have to try this, I would. But I'd be okay with a sip of yours or a half of someone else's, or so. Like I'm not ordering a flight of hoppy beers. It's just
Yeah,
not.
I'm.
It's not my
I,
deal.
and same here. I'm not really much of a drinker. Once in a while, maybe I'll have half a glass of wine, and then I got to chase it down with a Coke because to me, wine is rotten grapes. So I'll be the first to admit
Absolutely,
that. So
absolutely. Well, we went through the younger Paul, and
yeah,
that was the combine accent. We went through the mid Paul, and I said, "Are we in the third quarter of life or fourth?" And you definitely said off the air, "I'm still in the third quarter of the
yeah,
game. We
we're
are
not in
not
the
in the
fourth
fourth
or
quarter."
overtime. We're not hitting
We
overtime yet, Tommy. So
that will be on the. We'll make some YouTube shorts. That you saying you're not in the overtime.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
funny. Yeah,
yeah,
well, we'll Paul into the nursing home. No, you could live for another 50, 100 years, right?
yeah. Well,
Uh,
actually, what I'm doing now is I have a new blog because
mm-hmm.
the CLA kept the old one. The new blog is farmcpareport.com. So
FarmCPAReport.com.
report.com. And then
Okay.
I still do a podcast. Matter of fact, I recorded 2 podcasts this morning for Top Producer. I'm still doing a podcast for them. And on the blog, it's actually right now it's free, but it'll start transitioning over to sort of a paid subscription model here fairly quickly. Some of it'll remain free, but we're going to add more and more content to it. So just like anything else, I
Mm-hmm.
think farmers enjoy that content. I think they're willing to pay for it. I know CPAs are willing to pay for it. So we'll see. We'll see what happens with that.
No, that's very interesting. Yeah, there's in some things, one of the things I love to say is sometimes free is too expensive, and that you should be paying for things. There's some content you should consume, it should be free for whatever reason. It's just general thoughts and ideas. But when you become specific or recommendations, whether it be about markets or especially about accounting, um, you I know some of the best money I've spent is with CPAs, and whether it be that you need legal help or a CPA. I wrote down on the questions that one, I want to talk about agriculture, and we'll mix that in and out
Yep.
of here. But when it comes to being a CPA, and probably most of the people listening to this are involved in agriculture, can you explain how doing tax work is different from an agricultural standpoint on how they file taxes, when the year begins, when it doesn't,
Yeah. Yeah.
expenses, and then I want to get in that expenses. So truly take some time. There's no limit to this, how long this show goes, or whether we go long or short. But what's it mean to be an ag CPA?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. The tax code has more provisions in the tax code related to ag than any other industry by far. So farmers are allowed, if they choose to, they're allowed to file and pay their taxes by March 1st. So that's sort of called the March 1st filing deadline. It's technically not a deadline. It just means they don't have to pay an estimated tax payment on January 15th of each year. They can just file and pay by March 1st. Now, with the time value of money, interest rates going up, we've trained most of the farmers that I used to work with, we've trained most of them to either file their estimate on January 15th and then pay by April 15th because they actually make more money from a time value of money. And believe me, some of the worst tax returns that go out of a tax preparation office are prepared on February 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th because you're in such a hurry. You don't have time to adequately review it. So that's one thing. Also, almost all farm operations are allowed to be on the cash method of accounting,
Mm-hmm.
which means they only pick up income when they actually deposit that check and they get to deduct it when they write a check. And then, of course, we know farm machinery, you're able to buy that on debt, you can finance that. And then right now you can either write off 100% using section 179 up to $1,200,000 and change, or 80% using bonus. Now, that always sounds great in theory, Tommy, but
Mm-hmm.
if you're buying a $800,000 combine and you're financing it through John Deere or Case IH or wherever, and if you write it off all in year one, Yeah, that's great in year one, but in years 2, 3, 4, and 5, where you have not, you're making those principal payments, you got to create some taxable income to cover that principal payment. So that, and then you get on that vicious, I call it the treadmill. You get on the vicious
Mm-hmm.
treadmill, and sometimes it's a little hard to get off, or it can sort of hurt you when you get off. Now, one of my favorite sayings dealing with that is I tell people working capital you've paid tax on is yours. You can do whatever you want to with that working capital. But if you haven't paid taxes on it, it's either Uncle Sam's or it's the bank or it's both is telling you what to do. So I always tell my clients, hey, you want to have some working capital that's yours. You don't have to worry about, the Uncle Sam or the bank telling you what to do. And I
It's
think that's even
truly your
critical right
money,
now
right?
as we're going into lower rates on corn and soybeans and wheat pricing is certainly off the highs from the last couple of years.
Yeah, interesting that we're doing this today. So today is September 20th, 2023. But the Federal Reserve just met, and I had to personally shut off my cell phone because it's dinging and notifications, and Paul said this, Paul said that, and it's flashing, so I shut that off. But the Fed did not raise rates, but they have something called the dot plot. And if you look at what they said for 24, and you probably didn't even read this yet unless you're looking at the internet before we went live here, but they many people thought that they would lower rates significantly in 24. And in
No,
24, they still have us at a 5.1 Fed funds rate, which means not guaranteed. The way to not have a high interest rate would be to go into a terrible recession. They'd have to
right.
lower rates, but you don't want that. So the Fed pretty much just said 2 hours before this recording or an hour before this recording, interest rates are going to be high to the end of, not high, the new normal throughout 23 is this, and then the new normal for 24 is this. And that, if you're listening to this podcast, Google dot plot, and you'll learn a little about that. Um, that's a new
Yeah,
world because those years I met you, today's 23, go back 10 years, 13, go back 5, 7 years before that, I met you in 07, 08, 09. We artificially kept interest rates low for 12, 13 years.
yep.
So if you're 20 years old, got into farming 13 years ago, you may have known they can go up, but you've never been on this treadmill. And the way I describe it to clients and during other educational seminars is you've been walking on the treadmill at 3%, and some son of a bitch just raised it up to 10, and they won't let you off that.
Yep.
Is that a good description?
That's a good description. We have to realize back in '07, interest rates are basically where they're on now. And then we had the Great Recession of 8 and 9 that artificially dropped it towards zero, which is 3% or so for us. And like you said, that continued. It was starting to go up right before the pandemic
Mm-hmm.
hit, and then the pandemic hits, and then they brought them back down. So I think where rates are at now are not high. I think this is a reasonable plus or minus a point, or excuse me, 100 basis points. This is a pretty reasonable interest rate environment to be in. Lower rates tend to create people doing stupid things, and
Mm-hmm.
higher rates, if you go back to the 80s, that's too high. But, where we're at now, I think is, something that I think most farmers should be able to manage.
Okay. And I'm of the opinion that the reason that land that you bought in Iowa went from its value to its current value is that during the pandemic, we artificially really made rates low. So one of the side effects of the pandemic was crude oil going negative, sent crude down to 3, scared the heck out of people. Right when
Yep.
corn was making its multi-year lows is probably when you bought that land.
Exactly.
So crude went negative, corn went almost with the was two handle with the cash. People get scared, sell some ground. But then the ability for you to borrow money from one of the it could be a local bank or a farm credit service. I mean, the amount of money they were giving away, and then the farm credit system then sometimes will pay a dividend, a refund.
Yep.
There was literally you could have bought ground for 1.5, 2% money. So call it two for simple math, 2.5. You borrowed at 3, they give you half back. You're borrowing at 2.5. There is no 2.5% money anywhere now. When your Fed funds rate's at 5.1, most people talk about prime, and then you go, we're this much over prime, that much over prime. So I
Yeah.
would think, Paul, over the next few years, if commodity prices do continue to soften, corn, wheat, and beans due to overproduction across the world, that land prices should somewhat level off. But I also think there's been so much wealth created in ag that there's people who will still go out and pay top dollar, won't they?
Yeah, I think even when we had I'm going to call it the tougher times from about
Mm-hmm.
2014 to
Those got
2020.
tough.
Those were tough times, but you didn't really see land values drop. They sort of leveled off,
Mm-hmm.
maybe plus or minus a point or two each year. And I think you're right. I think over the next 5 or 10 years, you're probably going to see a leveling off, maybe a little reduction, unless rates really go up. If rates go up another 3 or 4 points, yeah, you're going to see land values go down, I think, by 30 or 40%.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll see. Like I say, there's a lot more wealth out there that's unleveraged. Unlike the
Right.
80s, the 80s issue was we had a lot of leverage in the 70s, extremely
Okay.
leveraged in the 70s, and it was all variable rate leverage. Now we have a lot of farmland that's been bought in the last 3 or 4 years at fixed rates, 2.5, three and a
Right.
half, even 4% is not bad. That isn't going to come due. I mean, it's fixed for 10, 20, 50, 25 years.
And I wanted to talk about the 80s. That's what got us, is that it was variable. So when rates went from 8% in the 80s, we went up to say 18%. Some people
Yep.
say 20, but just assume, I believe we were at 10 where we are now on loans, on some loans, and we went to 20. We did it very quickly, very
Yes.
intensely. You're old enough to, when you say the words Paul Volcker in front of any farm group, the older people get sick to their stomach. Why
Yeah.
is that?
Well, because Volcker, they tried to whip inflation. I'm old enough to remember when that slogan came out with, I think it was Nixon, whip inflation now, win, WIN.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Nixon, could have been Ford. They tried to correct inflation during the 70s. We had the two oil shocks. You had the 72, 73 oil shock. Then we had the 78, 79 oil shock from OPEC. They tried to correct it. They couldn't get it down, couldn't get it down. And Volcker came in and said, okay, we're going to shock the system. We're going to drive interest rates up until inflation's gone. So that's what caused rates to get up to that 15 to 20% range. And it happened, in less than a year? I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
was very, very quick. So
So this
similar to
has
what we
been,
had last year, where, every meeting, it was a half a point, a point. I think Volcker didn't he have a 2.5 or a 3 point or 300
he
basis point jump in one
he
one
jumped
one
it real
sitting.
hard. Yeah,
Yeah,
I couldn't
yeah.
imagine what it was like to be a bond trader back in the 80s, and of
It
course,
was great if you were short,
yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah,
it
yeah,
was. There was a few fortunes made, and I bet you a bunch
yeah.
lost. Of course, futures trading on bonds was very new then. I think it started in 78, 79. I'm going to ask you a question. The old bond traders at the Board of Trade, and this isn't a trick question. If you don't know, I'm not trying to mess with you. What they started in the Jenny May pit, and there was
Yep.
this Jenny May contract, and then the bond contract. So this is unrehearsed, unannounced. What the hell's a Jenny May?
So Ginnie Mae is a government-backed mortgage.
Mm-hmm.
So it was the Government National Mortgage Association. I think that's what Ginnie Mae stood for. And so it was typically a 30-year conforming bond mortgage, and that was what was traded. And then, like you said, they replaced it eventually with the
The
30-year
30.
bond, the 10-year note, and so
Note.
on. So,
Okay.
and I think part of it is Ginnie Mae might have been before Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac,
Mm-hmm.
or they were sort of all wind up and they just called it. I think it was Freddie Mac. Fannie Mae was part of Ginnie Mae. Ginnie Mae was sort of
They're all
what they called it.
cousins. Sounds
Yeah,
like that.
yeah,
They're
yeah,
they're just a family.
yeah.
Well, I remember I'd say, oh, how did so and so do well? Well, he started in the Jenny May pit, and then the Board of Trade introduced the 30-year bond contract, and then we had the 10-year and the 5-year and the 2-year and Fed funds and whatnot. That's interesting. Well, we're busting through the topics here, and this is fun to do this with you. Of all days, we tried to do this a week or two ago. We had a equipment malfunction, but you had since Amazon apparently stops by your house just as
Oh,
often it does mine,
yeah, yeah.
and
My wife is definitely. I think if they have a top 5%, my wife would be in that top 5%. I think.
it's just food for the dogs or every there's always a reason why the truck comes around our cul-de-sac, right? Oh, I
Yeah,
just needed this. Hey,
yeah,
a lot of
exactly.
times it's for me too. I can't kid you. I wanted to talk about, as we start to wrap up the show, for the young people, how long have we been on here? I'm looking. Oh, yep, we're going right at a half hour. I like that. For the
Yep.
young people listening, or old people, or anyone, there, well, in grain marketing, we used to call it store and ignore. That's not going to work so well
No,
anymore.
no.
And spending every dollar you have so you don't owe taxes, that could be a mistake. Is that correct?
I definitely
Give?
think it's correct in that, like I said, if you're spending every dollar, you're not really setting yourself up very well for the times when times are going to be bad. We know in farming, over a 30-year cycle, you have about 5, maybe 7 really good years. You have
Mm-hmm.
5 or 7 really bad years, and then the rest are sort of what I call mediocre years. And when you have those good years, you need to bank it. If you're spending it just to get rid of taxes, that's probably not the smartest thing to do.
I know a guy who did that once.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We all know
There's
those people.
Well, there's you can, what you think may be right at the time could come to backfire. And that thing you
Yep.
said a little bit ago about having that cash, that's not the bankers, that's not owed to the government, just having your money. Not saying I have an operating note I could take from, but saying, you know what, I have X amount of cash right now. And to your point, an incredible amount of farmland, I think in Iowa in particular, incredible amount of farmland is owned by women whose spouses have passed, and
And
it's
it's all free and
all
clear.
paid for in
Yep.
cash. So
Yep.
you're not going to shake that ground out. They have something in Iowa, maybe they have it in other states. I just know Iowa because I we have an office in Bettendorf that I spend a lot of time at now. But they have the Century Farm, a
Yep.
hundred
Yep.
years of
So it's been in the family for
yeah.
100 years. Yep. Yeah.
And I'm starting to meet more and more and more clients who are like, oh, we went to our celebration of the Century Farm. It's a
Yeah.
really big deal. It's something to be really proud of, and
Yeah. On
it's
my mother's side, now it wasn't in the same location. It was close. They're coming, well, they need about another 15 years and they'll hit the Century Farm at the location of Walla Walla. My grandfather immigrated from Norway in the early 1900s and started farming in a little town of Hay, Washington, which is about
mhm.
40 people. And I think half of them were related to my mother. And then they moved to Walla Walla in 1942. So I guess about another, well, I guess 19 more years, it'll be 100 years.
That's really neat. Yeah, that's a big deal. Well, it's interesting that the times we've known, I have to tell you from a marketing grain trading standpoint, things were not normal during the pandemic, and
Nope.
they definitely were not normal coming out of it with the money the government gave away, not just our government, but other governments, artificially low interest rates and explosive amount of cash to the system, which was meant to spur the economy. It did. Hence, we have inflation. Of
Yep.
course, as you remember, that was
Yeah. Yeah.
transitory till it wasn't.
Yeah.
And now they want to your reference before, whip inflation. And Jay Powell's talking right now about what we're going to do and the dot plot and everything else. And somewhere in all this, you need your cash, and I tell people from my office in North Dakota is at a bank, is pay the taxes while you can so that on the years you need to borrow the money, you can show that you were profitable. If you're
Yep.
always pretending you're not profitable, what are you going to do when you're really not profitable?
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah. It'll catch up to you. Now, a lot of your bankers, if you've been prepaying or pushing grain down the road, they're going to do what I call an accrual set of financial
Mm-hmm.
statements. So they're going to be able to determine, they sort of ignore the tax return. It's the starting point, and then they come up with what they think you really made. So during those time periods, maybe even though you're showing a quote a loss on your tax return, they can tell that you're making money. But if that goes on too long, or if you start using what I call, the non-bank financing, where
Mm-hmm.
you're getting money or you're getting a lot of terms from Nutrien or Cargill, or whoever it might be, that can catch up with you
CHS.
too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Real quick. Last question. Then we'll, obviously reintroduce you. You tell people how to get a hold of you. I look at farming kind of like the mafia. They let you in, but they don't let you out. How, as we end the show, can you explain to people from a tax standpoint, in your mind, with all your expertise, someone who's been in this their whole career, what is a general plan to get out of farming?
One thing that we really like to use, especially for those farmers that as they approach retirement, they're not leveraged, they pretty well have paid off their debt, but they have this massive amount of grain. The last year of farming, they have all the expenses in the year of harvest, but they sell all the grain in the following year. We like to use what's called a charitable remainder trust. It allows that farmer to sell their grain for cash and then take the income out over 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, up to 20 years, and spread that tax liability out over that period. So I tell people effectively they sold their grain for cash, yet they get to report it on the installment method. So that's one of the things that we like to see a farmer take advantage of. There's some other things, but like you say, it's similar to, I always ask the younger people when I'm talking, what's the most famous song by the Eagles? And, I'm trying to go for Hotel California. It was easy to check in, but you could never check out. And you're right. It is difficult on a tax standpoint for a farmer to get out of retirement without having, maybe a 5-year window, a 10-year window to look at. Hey, we need to be planning for this over the next 3 to 5 years. Farmers that come in and tell me, hey, this is my last crop and I don't want to pay any taxes. Well, it's a little difficult to really plan for that. So if we have a 3 to 5 year window,
do they not love America? They don't want to pay taxes.
Yeah, they're willing to pay 10 grand. If it's got 6 digits or more, they're not willing to pay that. So yeah,
that's interesting. Now, one other thing I've noticed, I don't know a lot of it, but I'm sure you come across a lot of it in your career: sudden death. Like, there's a husband and wife, they're farmers, and everyone knows if the husband dies, the wife's going to take over and she'll figure it out. And hopefully she's around good people. If the husband and wife die in a car accident together and they didn't have their ducks in order, as we say, that could be a disaster. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, and it depends what state you're in. The state next to you, Illinois, has got Illinois estate tax. You got the federal estate tax. If you haven't done good planning between those two states, or the state I'm from, Washington State, between Washington and the federal government, they can take almost 60% of your wealth over a certain level. And actually, Washington's talking about making it even worse than that. Hopefully that doesn't go through, because due to the fact that I do own farmland in Washington, my heirs face an estate tax, even though the exemption there is it's about 2.2 million, and my land there is only worth maybe, let's say, $1 million, but it's based on your total net worth. And if that's over 2.2 million, then you have to pay some estate tax. So I'm actually meeting with an estate tax attorney next week to try to alleviate that a little bit. I know I need to address it. So
smart.
Now, the other thing that's good about death, and I don't want to be too facetious about it, but death tends to cure a lot of tax ills on the income tax side. So for that farmer that had that $2 million of grain, and he happens to pass away owning that grain, his heirs, the wife or the kids, are able to sell that grain tax-free. So when I'm talking to a lot of taxpayers, sort of as a joke, and it's probably a bad joke, I say your heirs want you to pass away because that eliminates all the tax issues. So,
they understand
that's not the best tax planning.
That's not how you open up your speeches.
Yeah, no, I don't. I might close it with that, but I don't open it with it. So
I like it. Paul, as we wrap up the show, I want to thank you. You are in what city one more time in Colorado?
I'm in Parker, Colorado. And how people can reach me is, first, the blog is at farmcpareport.com. My email is farmcpa@outlook.com. So just farmcpa@outlook.com. And if they want to reach out to me and send me a text or give me a call, it's my cell phone is 509-961-9739.
Well, what a wonderful, trusting American soul you are. What a kind person. Mother's maiden name and a few other things, and we'll have it wrapped up, for love of God. I love it. Well, Paul, this was fun. We'll do it again. And I hope to see you in my travels this winter. I'm definitely spending a lot more time here in the basement doing this type of stuff. But I do know when we cross paths, it's always fun.
I'm sure we'll run into each other somewhere. So again, thanks a lot for having me on the show, Tommy.
Thanks, Paul. My name's Tommy Grisafi, and I'm Bullish Agriculture.